In the autumn of 1987, contractors renovating the old Bramwell estate in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, made a discovery that would force authorities to reopen files that had been sealed for nearly 4 decades. Beneath the rotting floorboards of what had once been the family's prayer room, workers uncovered a collection of leather-bound journals, wedding certificates, and photographs that documented one of Appalachia's most disturbing family dynasties. The images showed 2 young women in identical wedding dresses, standing beside the same elderly man on what appeared to be the same day. The journals, written in the trembling hand of Ezekiel Bramwell, contained entries that read more like breeding records than family chronicles. But it was the final photograph in the collection that made the contractor immediately contact the sheriff's department. A family portrait showing children whose physical deformities suggested generations of genetic collapse. Their hollow eyes staring into the camera with an otherworldly emptiness that seemed to pierce through time itself. Before we uncover these buried truths, subscribe and comment which mountains you're watching from. It helps preserve these dark histories that powerful families tried to erase. The story begins in 1889, when Ezekiel Bramwell first arrived in the isolated valleys of Pocahontas County with nothing but a wagon, 2 milk cows, and an obsession with what he called preserving the pure bloodline. According to county records discovered in the courthouse basement, Bramwell purchased over 3,000 acres of mountainous terrain for a fraction of its value, land so remote that it wouldn't see electricity until the 1950s. The deed, signed with a shaking hand, listed his occupation as gentleman farmer, though no one in the surrounding communities ever recalled seeing him sell crops or livestock. What made Ezekiel different from other mountain patriarchs was his education. Census records from 1890 list him as one of only 3 college-educated men in the county, having attended what is now West Virginia University, before mysteriously departing in his final semester. His abandoned thesis, discovered decades later in the university archives, was titled Hereditary Traits and the Preservation of Superior Bloodlines in Isolated Populations. The paper contained detailed charts mapping family trees and calculations about genetic outcomes that wouldn't be fully understood by mainstream science for another 30 years. By 1895, Ezekiel had married his first wife, a 16-year-old girl named Mercy Caldwell, whose family had traded her hand in marriage for $75 and the promise that their debts to the company's store would be forgiven. Mercy bore him 7 children in rapid succession, but it was his treatment of his daughters that would define the Bramwell legacy. According to the journals found beneath the floorboards, Ezekiel began documenting his children's physical characteristics from birth, measuring their skulls, recording the color of their eyes, and noting what he called hereditary markers of quality. But the most disturbing entries began appearing in 1912, when his eldest daughters, Ruth and Rebecca, reached what their father determined was breeding age. The twins, born just minutes apart, had been raised in complete isolation on the family compound. They could read and write. Ezekiel insisted on educating his children to a level far beyond their mountain neighbors, but they had never spoken to anyone outside their immediate family. Their world consisted of the main house, the prayer cabin, and the family cemetery that Ezekiel had established on a hill overlooking the valley. The first wedding took place on October 13, 1913, a date Ezekiel had calculated using what he called celestial mathematics. Ruth Bramwell, 19 years old and described in her father's notes as possessing ideal cranial measurements and superior birthing hips, was married to her father in a ceremony conducted in the family's prayer cabin. The marriage certificate, filed with the county clerk just days before West Virginia raised the minimum marriage age, listed Ezekiel as both father of the bride and groom. 3 days later, Rebecca underwent the same ceremony. The photographs discovered in 1987 show both girls in identical white dresses that their father had ordered from a catalogue, their faces bearing the hollow expression of the condemned. In his journal entry from that week, Ezekiel wrote, "The covenant is sealed. 2 perfect vessels have been prepared for the continuation of our superior line. God has blessed this union with his silence." What happened next was documented with the clinical precision of a livestock breeder. Ezekiel maintained detailed records of both pregnancies, tracking every symptom, measuring the growth of their bellies, and predicting birth dates based on what he called hereditary cycles. Ruth gave birth first in June of 1914 to a son whom Ezekiel named Cain. Rebecca delivered 3 weeks later, producing twin boys whom their father christened Abel and Seth. The children's birth certificates tell a story of bureaucratic confusion and small-town complicity. All 3 boys are listed as Bramwell, with Ezekiel recorded as their father. Their mothers are listed simply as Ruth B. and Rebecca B., with no indication of their relationship to their husband. Dr. Samuel Wickham, the physician who attended all 3 births, would later tell a state inspector that he had been paid $50, more than most mountain families saw in a year, to ask no questions and file the paperwork exactly as instructed. But it was Dr. Wickham's private notes, discovered among his papers after his death in 1958, that revealed the true horror of what was happening in the Bramwell compound. The children, he wrote, exhibit signs of what can only be described as genetic degradation. Enlarged craniums, webbed digits on the left hands, and eyes that seem to track movement independently. The girls, their mothers, appear to have aged a decade in the span of their pregnancies. They speak only when spoken to, and then only in whispers. By 1920, the Bramwell compound had become a small village unto itself. Ezekiel had constructed additional cabins for his growing family, designing them according to what he claimed were divine architectural principles. Each structure was built with doors that opened inward, windows that faced only north, and rooms arranged in patterns that seemed to follow no earthly logic. Visitors, the few who were permitted, reported feeling disoriented within minutes of entering any of the buildings, as if the very walls were designed to trap and confuse. Ruth and Rebecca had each produced 4 more children by 1920, though county records show that only 6 of the 10 births resulted in children who survived past their first year. The infant mortality rate on the Bramwell compound was nearly 4 times higher than the already devastating average for rural Appalachia, but no official investigation was ever conducted. Ezekiel had cultivated relationships with key county officials through generous donations to their campaigns and timely loans during difficult harvests. The surviving children exhibited increasingly disturbing physical characteristics. A report filed by a traveling state health inspector in 1922 described them as displaying signs of severe inbreeding, including but not limited to microcephaly, polydactyly, and what appears to be premature aging. The inspector, a man named Harrison Gilchrist, recommended immediate intervention by state authorities, but his report was buried in bureaucratic channels and never acted upon. Gilchrist himself died under mysterious circumstances just 3 months later, found at the bottom of a ravine with injuries that the coroner described as consistent with a fall, though the location of the body raises questions. But it was the children's behavior, not just their appearance, that marked them as products of Ezekiel's twisted experiment. Neighbors reported seeing them moving through the forest in single file, communicating through a series of hand gestures that no outsider could interpret. They hunted in packs, taking deer and wild boar with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural, and they were seen on multiple occasions conducting what appeared to be ritual ceremonies in a clearing deep in the Bramwell woods, ceremonies that involved animal sacrifices and symbols carved into living trees. The most disturbing report came from a Methodist preacher named Elias Tompkins, who had attempted to visit the compound in 1923 to offer Christian guidance to the family. Tompkins described being met at the property line by 6 children, he couldn't determine their ages or genders, who stood motionless and silent until he turned and left. They never spoke, he wrote in his account, but I could hear their voices in my head, telling me things that no Christian soul should ever contemplate. They were not children. They were something else entirely. As his daughters aged and their fertility began to decline, Ezekiel turned his attention to the 3rd generation. In 1928, when Cain reached 14 and his half-sister Mary turned 13, their grandfather began preparing for what he called the 3rd covenant. Mary, born to Rebecca in 1915, had survived when many of her siblings had not, and Ezekiel's journals reveal his belief that she represented the pinnacle of his breeding program. "She possesses all the markers of perfection," he wrote in an entry dated March 15, 1928. "The cranial measurements exceed even her mother's, and the peculiar eye coloration suggests that the bloodline has achieved the purity I have sought. The union of Cain and Mary will produce the first true children of the new race." The wedding was conducted in absolute secrecy on the winter solstice of 1928, with only the immediate family in attendance. No marriage certificate was ever filed with the county, but photographs from the ceremony show a gathering that more closely resembled a pagan ritual than a Christian wedding. Cain, barely 15, stands beside his 13-year-old half-sister in a clearing surrounded by torches, both wearing robes that appear to be made from animal pelts. Behind them, the assembled family members hold what appear to be carved wooden dolls, each one twisted into an unnatural pose. Mary's pregnancy was difficult from the start. Dr. Wickham's notes, written in increasingly shaky handwriting as his own health declined, describe complications that seem to defy medical explanation. "The child appears to be growing at an accelerated rate," he wrote in May of 1929. "The mother's abdomen has expanded to a size consistent with twins, though examinations reveal only a single fetus. Most disturbing, the child appears to be moving in patterns that suggest conscious thought, complex motions that seem to respond to external stimuli." But it was the birth itself in September of 1929 that finally broke Dr. Wickham's silence. The child, a boy whom Ezekiel named Jeremiah, was born with what the physician described as anatomical impossibilities. In a letter to the state medical board that was never sent, it was found among his papers with "unsent" written across the top in red ink. Wickham wrote, "The infant exhibits characteristics that cannot be explained by any known medical condition. Additional appendages that serve no apparent function, eyes that appear to focus independently, and vocalizations that seem to form patterns resembling speech, despite the child's newborn status." The end of the Bramwell dynasty came not through outside intervention, but through the very genetic collapse that Ezekiel had inadvertently engineered. By 1935, the compound housed nearly 30 individuals, all of them direct descendants of the original patriarch and his daughters. But fertility rates had plummeted, and those children who were born rarely survived their first year. The survivors showed increasingly severe developmental problems, both physical and mental, that made them unable to function even within their isolated community. Ezekiel's final journal entries, dated in the winter of 1936, reveal a man whose obsession had become complete madness. "They are perfect," he wrote in shaking handwriting, "but perfection cannot sustain itself in this corrupted world. The children see things that others cannot see, know things that others cannot know. They speak to presences that walk among us unseen. This is not failure. This is transcendence." The fire that consumed the main Bramwell house on February 14, 1937, was reported by neighbors living more than 5 miles away. By the time the volunteer fire department reached the compound, the structure had been reduced to a pile of ash and twisted metal. The heat had been so intense that it melted the iron fittings on the doors and windows, and the peculiar green color of the flames, witnessed by multiple reliable sources, suggested that something other than wood and fabric had been burning. Investigators found the remains of 11 individuals in the ruins, though the condition of the bodies made positive identification impossible. The coroner's report, filed 3 weeks after the fire, listed the cause of death as smoke inhalation, but noted several anomalies that were never satisfactorily explained. The skeletal remains showed unusual bone density and structure, particularly in the skull regions, and several of the bodies appeared to have additional rib bones beyond the normal count. Most disturbing was the discovery of what investigators initially assumed were animal remains scattered throughout the debris. Closer examination revealed that these were actually human remains, but from individuals whose bone structure was so severely malformed that they barely qualified as recognizably human. The official report classified them as probable genetic abnormalities resulting from extended inbreeding, but the investigating officer, a man named Curtis Whitlow, wrote in his private notes, These weren't human children. I don't know what they were, but they weren't human. Not all of the Bramwell family perished in the fire. 3 members were known to have survived. Jeremiah, now 7 years old, and living in a cabin at the far edge of the property. His Aunt Sarah, one of Ruth's daughters, who had been visiting relatives in a neighboring county, and a young woman named Patience, whose exact relationship to the family was never clearly established. Jeremiah was found by investigators 3 days after the fire, living alone in a one-room cabin that seemed to have been prepared for extended isolation. The child appeared to be caring for himself with an efficiency that authorities found deeply unsettling in someone so young. He could read and write at a level far beyond his years, had been maintaining detailed records of weather patterns and animal movements, and possessed an adult understanding of survival skills that included food preservation, herbal medicine, and trap construction. But it was Jeremiah's physical appearance that truly shocked the social workers assigned to his case. Despite being only 7 years old, he stood nearly as tall as a typical 10-year-old, with adult-proportioned hands and facial features that seemed to shift depending on the viewing angle. His eyes, described in multiple reports as unnaturally large and reflective, appeared to track movement in ways that suggested peripheral vision far beyond normal human capacity. The state's attempt to place Jeremiah in foster care proved unsuccessful. 3 separate families reported that the child exhibited behaviors that made them profoundly uncomfortable. He would stare at walls for hours as if watching something invisible, carried on what appeared to be conversations with empty rooms, and demonstrated knowledge of family histories and personal secrets that he could not possibly have known. Most disturbing, all 3 families reported that their other children began exhibiting similar behaviors within days of Jeremiah's arrival, as if his presence was somehow contagious. The final foster family, the Hendersons of Lewisburg, lasted only 4 days before demanding Jeremiah's removal. In their report to the state, they described finding the child standing in their backyard at 3 in the morning, surrounded by every stray animal in the neighborhood. "They weren't moving," Mrs. Henderson wrote. "Not the boy or the animals. They were all just standing there, perfectly still, like they were waiting for something. When I called to him, they all turned to look at me at the same time. The boy and all the animals, and I've never been so frightened in my life." Jeremiah Bramwell disappeared from state custody in August of 1938, vanishing from a group home in Charleston without leaving any trace of his passage. The search was extensive but ultimately fruitless. It was as if the child had simply ceased to exist. But over the following decades, reports began surfacing from across Appalachia of encounters with an individual who matched his description, though the sightings suggested that he was aging at a rate far slower than normal human development. In 1952, a hiking party in the Monongahela National Forest reported meeting a young man who claimed to be studying the migration patterns of local wildlife. They described him as appearing to be in his early 20s, tall and pale, with unusually large eyes, who demonstrated an encyclopedic knowledge of the forest ecosystem. What made the encounter memorable was his ability to call wild animals to him with a series of soft vocalizations, causing deer, rabbits, and even a black bear to approach without fear. The hikers were so unsettled by the experience that they cut their trip short and reported the incident to park rangers. Similar sightings occurred throughout the 1960s and 1970s, always describing the same individual, tall, pale, ageless, appearing in remote wilderness areas across West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and western Virginia. Forest Service employees, hunters, and backpackers reported encounters with someone who seemed to move through the wilderness with supernatural ease, appearing and disappearing without warning, always alone, always watching. The most credible sighting came in 1981, when a team of wildlife biologists conducting a survey in Pocahontas County encountered an individual they initially assumed was a fellow researcher. Dr. Margaret Chen, the team leader, described him as possibly 30 years old, extremely knowledgeable about local ecology, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to predict animal behavior. The encounter lasted nearly 3 hours, during which the stranger shared observations about genetic variations in local deer populations that wouldn't be confirmed by scientific studies until years later. But it was the birth itself in September of 1929 that finally broke Dr. Wickham's silence. The child, a boy whom Ezekiel named Jeremiah, was born with what the physician described as anatomical impossibilities. In a letter to the State Medical Board that was never sent, it was found among his papers with "unsent" written across the top in red ink. Wickham wrote, "The infant exhibits characteristics that cannot be explained by any known medical condition, additional appendages that serve no apparent function, eyes that appear to focus independently, and vocalizations that seem to form patterns resembling speech, despite the child's newborn status." The end of the Bramwell dynasty came not through outside intervention, but through the very genetic collapse that Ezekiel had inadvertently engineered. By 1935, the compound housed nearly 30 individuals, all of them direct descendants of the original patriarch and his daughters. But fertility rates had plummeted, and those children who were born rarely survived their first year. The survivors showed increasingly severe developmental problems, both physical and mental, that made them unable to function even within their isolated community. It was only when Dr. Chen mentioned the encounter to local residents that she learned the individual's description matched reports going back decades. "They told me I had met the Bramwell boy," she wrote in her field notes. "When I asked what they meant, they just shook their heads and said some bloodlines don't die the way they're supposed to." The journals discovered in 1987 provided the first comprehensive look at the true scope of Ezekiel Bramwell's experiment. Written in a mixture of English, Latin, and what appeared to be a coded language of his own creation, the documents revealed a mind that had moved far beyond simple inbreeding into something approaching systematic genetic manipulation. References to bloodline enhancement through selective breeding, hereditary trait amplification, and the cultivation of superior human variants suggested that Ezekiel had been attempting to breed for specific characteristics that he believed would produce superhuman offspring. Most disturbing were the detailed anatomical drawings found throughout the later journals, sketches of human forms with additional limbs, enlarged craniums, and sensory organs positioned in locations that defied normal anatomy. These weren't the fantasies of a madman. They were technical blueprints, complete with measurements and genetic predictions that suggested a deep understanding of heredity principles that weren't formally recognized by science until decades later. Ezekiel's final journal entries, dated in the winter of 1936, reveal a man whose obsession had become complete madness. "They are perfect," he wrote in shaking handwriting, "but perfection cannot sustain itself in this corrupted world. The children see things that others cannot see, know things that others cannot know. They speak to presences that walk among us unseen. This is not failure. This is transcendence." The photographs discovered with the journals told an even darker story. Images of children with physical characteristics that seemed to match Ezekiel's drawings, family portraits showing individuals whose features appeared to be shifting between human and something else entirely, and ceremonial gatherings where the participants seemed to be engaged in rituals that incorporated elements of both Christian worship and something far more ancient and disturbing. But it was the final photograph in the collection that forced investigators to contact federal authorities. The image, dated 1936 and apparently taken just months before the fire, showed the entire Bramwell clan arranged in front of the main house. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard family portrait, but closer examination revealed details that defied rational explanation. Several of the individuals in the photograph appeared to be standing in positions that would be physically impossible given the shadows and lighting, as if they had been photographed separately and combined into a single image using techniques that didn't exist in 1936. More disturbing was the discovery that some of the faces in the photograph matched descriptions of Jeremiah from sightings that occurred years after the picture was supposedly taken. Either the photograph had been mislabeled, or something far more unsettling was occurring within the Bramwell bloodline. The Bramwell compound remained abandoned for over 50 years, the land eventually reverting to the state when no living heirs could be located to pay the accumulated taxes. The foundations of the burned buildings were bulldozed in the 1960s during a federal forest management project, but workers reported finding structural elements that seemed to defy the building techniques available in the early 1900s. Stone foundations were discovered that extended nearly 20 feet walls. Underground, far deeper than necessary for mountain construction, arranged in patterns that seemed to follow astronomical alignments rather than architectural logic. Local residents have long claimed that the Bramwell property remains actively haunted, though their descriptions of the supernatural activity differ significantly from typical ghost stories. Rather than reporting apparitions or unexplained sounds, witnesses describe encountering living individuals who appear perfectly normal until observed closely, at which point their features seem to shift and blur in ways that suggest they exist partially outside normal physical reality. The most persistent reports involve children, always described as unusually tall and pale, with eyes that reflect light like animal eyes, who appear near the old property boundaries during certain phases of the moon. These encounters are consistently described as non-threatening but deeply unsettling, with the children displaying knowledge of local history and family genealogies that they could not possibly possess through normal means. Dr. Chen, the wildlife biologist who encountered the individual she believed to be Jeremiah Bramwell, returned to the area in 2010 to conduct a follow-up study. Her research revealed genetic anomalies in the local wildlife population that appeared to center around the former Bramwell property. Deer, black bears, and smaller mammals in the immediate area showed cranial enlargements and behavioral patterns that differed significantly from populations elsewhere in the region. Most puzzling, these genetic variations appeared to be increasing rather than diminishing over time, as if some external influence was continuing to affect the local ecosystem. It's as if, Dr. Chen wrote in her final report, the Bramwell experiment didn't end with the fire. Something in that bloodline persists, and it's continuing to influence everything it comes into contact with. We may be looking at a form of genetic contamination that operates according to principles we don't yet understand. The documents discovered in 1987 were classified by federal authorities within months of their recovery. The official explanation cited national security concerns and potential public health implications. But researchers who had briefly examined the materials before their classification reported finding references to government contacts that suggested Ezekiel Bramwell had not been working entirely alone. Correspondence fragments mentioned advisors from the capital and federal oversight of the breeding program, implying that Bramwell's experiment may have been part of a larger officially sanctioned project. References to Project Lineage and the Virginia trials suggested that similar experiments were being conducted simultaneously in other remote locations throughout Appalachia, all under the coordination of an unnamed government agency. These revelations take on a more sinister cast when considered alongside the well-documented history of unethical medical experiments conducted on rural populations throughout the early to mid-20th century. The isolation of the Bramwell compound, the family's unusual level of education and resources, and the systematic nature of Ezekiel's record-keeping all suggest that what occurred in Pocahontas County may have been less about one man's obsession and more about a deliberate attempt to explore the boundaries of human genetic manipulation. The current status of the classified documents remains unknown. Repeated Freedom of Information Act requests have been denied, and the few researchers who possessed copies of the materials before their classification have reported that their files were confiscated during federal raids conducted under sealed warrants. The official position is that no such documents ever existed, despite the documented testimony of dozens of witnesses who examined them.